Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thanks for being here. Before I was doing this kind of work, my background is actually in marriage and family therapy. So it's all about kind of the people and relationships and how do we manage that. And for the last, 8 or 9 years, I've been applying that skill set in the world of leadership and organizational development. And so tonight, what we're talking about is something that is, I think, a really cool topic because it's so broadly applicable to everyone, from the individual to somebody who's managing a team, to even on some levels to even a larger organization. There are so many ways we can take some of the principles that we'll cover and use those regardless of what size your business is or who you are. One thing I'd like you to start with is in your journals, first page where you can take notes, write the letters A, H, A. And of course that's aha. And what I want you to put on this page is as we go through the workshop tonight, as you come across insights and something clicks for you that you feel like is really valuable, that's really a sticky thing for you, right? Go to that page and write it down. Remember, if everything is important, then nothing's important. There's lots of room for you to take notes. Reserve the aha page for those things that really rise to the top that you want to take with you. On the second page, write action items. Because the biggest barrier to taking things from a workshop like this and actually applying them in real life is the threshold. On our way out, what things are we going to remember? What things are we going to forget? How are we actually going to take this and make sure that we get opportunities to use it? And so these pages are really designed to make sure that you have a place that you can go back to and just see a few things that you can take with you and make sure that you're able to keep those and apply those as you go out into the real world. Okay? So that said, I'm going to start with trade-offs. So a trade-off, the definition here is that it means that that more of one thing necessitates less of another. Okay? And if you're interested to learn more about this, there's a resource on the back page of your notebook. It's an article from a guy named Michael Porter. He was a professor at Harvard Business School for years and years and is a really well-known name in the world of business strategy. And he talks about trade-offs being really important in crafting a winning strategy. Right? So let's get out of the world of baked goods and into the world of business here. Anybody here heard of a company called IKEA? Okay, what do we know about IKEA? So the business model is we can ship things in flat pack boxes and we can save a lot on shipping. Right? Because we don't have to assemble and ship bigger products, then we can keep the price down and we can spend some of that money on design. And so IKEA has identified a segment of the market that is interested in attractive design at an affordable price point. And the trade-off that they're making, if you're buying from IKEA, is that you're willing to put it together. Right? Now, if you were to think about complaints people have about that process, what do you think people might complain about? Missing pieces or the assembling of the furniture. I think trying to assemble a piece of furniture with other people is a real test of your friendship, right? It can be stressful, it can be frustrating. And so when you think about that trade-off, what if a company like IKEA said, okay, we hear you, you don't want to assemble the furniture, we're now going to sell fully assembled furniture. What are the effects of them responding in that way? And so really when you think about IKEA's strategy, their whole value proposition is targeted at a specific audience that is willing to accept the trade-off that they're making as a business. They're not trying to be like all the other furniture companies that are selling assembled furniture. They're offering something different and something unique. And there's a trade-off involved in that, right? More of one thing necessitates less of another. So let me give you a smaller business analogy. So this goes back to my family therapy days when I started private practice here in the Pacific Northwest. So as a therapist, I was moving from out of state. So I was starting a practice in a town I'd never been to, much less lived in. Okay? I'd done my market research, looked at how many people live here, how many therapists are there, if you look online, and found a place that seemed favorable. But then one of the things that I noticed, and this is something that therapists in particular really struggle with, is that most people were marketing themselves as sort of a generalist. They didn't necessarily have a specialty, or they say, I specialize in, and then have a list of 14 things that they specialize in, which everybody knows you can't have 14 specialties. They're afraid of missing out on clients. If I don't say that I do all these things, then some people will come to my website and they'll say, oh, this isn't for me because I don't see myself there, right? Now, the flaw in that logic, though, right, is if everybody's doing that, then nobody's differentiated, right? You know, you've probably heard the phrase, you could probably finish this sentence for me. If you're talking to everyone, you're talking to no one, right? So that's what happens when we get overly general, is we're talking to everybody and we don't stand out. So one of the bets that I made is one of my areas of specialty was couples therapy. I had a couple other things that I did, but I decided, you know what if I just niche into this, craft my messaging so it's specifically to people looking for couples therapy in this geographic area, and really make that gamble is what it felt like. I had some trepidation about it. I thought, oh no, what if I get too narrow? Are there enough clients in this segment to support my business? Right? Now, here's the interesting thing that happened though, is after a few months of having my website online and being listed in a directory, then what I started to see happen is that if people were searching for therapists in this area where I was located, if they were searching for couples therapists in particular, I was reliably going to be the first, second, or third result that they saw in terms of organic search results and also in terms of what showed up on the Google business listing. And then the other people that they were seeing next to my business were people who weren't necessarily specializing, right? They had good SEO, they were showing up in search results, but they weren't necessarily specializing. So if you're looking for something like a therapist and you go and you see the top 3 results and only one of them is really talking specifically about providing what you need, right? Then you think about who are you going to choose? Okay? That's an example of a trade-off that I made that really paid off for me and turned into a successful practice. Right? Especially as small business owners, it's so hard to make those trade-offs because we don't know exactly what's going to happen. It feels risky to narrow our focus too much. And we want to make sure we don't alienate a certain percentage too much of the market that we might appeal to. But in doing that, so often what we end up doing is we end up kind of trying to talk to everyone, to be everything to everyone, rather than finding a way to differentiate ourselves and to really make a bet on the thing that makes us different. I've got a few questions for you as you think about your own business and really kind of workshop this with each other. First, what are 1 or 2 trade-offs that are relevant for your business? These could be trade-offs that you're already making, trade-offs that you could consider making. Okay. What are some of the pros and cons of making those trade-offs? Why might you be reluctant to make that trade-off? What might be the benefit of making that trade-off? And that's where we get to the third question. How can making one of these trade-offs help your business be successful? And these are the kind of questions that can help us identify opportunities for us to differentiate and really play to our strengths as a business. But there's a lot here around our own personal and professional development, and they're very much related. Right? How I'm developing myself as an individual has a lot to do with how I go about developing my business. For example, if I know that for myself, I'm pretty risk averse, knowing that in going out and trying to operate my business or to get it started, get it off the ground, it's really a good idea to make sure we're working on ourselves and developing ourselves along the way. Because sometimes we can be our greatest asset and sometimes we can be our greatest hindrance, right? Depending on how well we're developing our skills and our talents and our strengths along the way. Okay? So to come back to what you had said, I'll move this board for just a second so you can see this. Okay? A quote from a guy named Don Clifton, okay? Big name in the world of positive psychology and strengths-based development. I'll read it out for us. At an early age, you started hearing it. It's a virtue to be well-rounded. They might as well have said, become as dull as you possibly can be. And the idea here is that if we're all trying to come to some middle and be well-rounded as individuals, we kind of lose the strength of our diversity and being different and bringing different things to the table. Individuals leaning into their strengths and then partnering with others to make well-rounded teams is a more effective way to go than for all of us to try to be coming to some middle ground and all be sort of the same well-rounded individual. Right, so let's take a look at how this might show up. Okay? So this is called the Big 5 model of personality. It's one of the more academic models for personality. Personality is really hard to study because it's so complex and there are so many different factors. But these 5 factors, the acronym is OCEAN, again, also called the Big 5 model of personality. has been studied and tested across dozens and dozens of different countries and cultures. And these 5 elements of personality and human behavior tend to show up pretty consistently. So the first one is openness to experience. Right, on the one end, and think of these as continuums of human behavior. You're going to see yourself on both sides of this. But we kind of have a home base. We kind of have a place where we like to live. But we are going to do different things in different contexts. Okay? But openness to experience, on the one end, we have sort of inventive and curious. Okay? Maybe a little more adventurous, open to new things. On the other end, we have consistent, maybe more cautious. The second dimension is conscientiousness. On one end of that continuum, we have more efficient or organized. And on the other end, we have more extravagant and carefree. Right? Now, as I read these, notice yourself if you're having some value judgments about which one of these is good and which one of these is not good. Okay? And just pay attention to that for a second, and we'll talk more about it. We have extrovertedness, being more outgoing and energetic versus more solitary and reserved. Agreeableness, more friendly and compassionate versus more critical and rational. And finally, neuroticism, really negative sounding word, but don't knock it, we'll talk. Okay? Sensitive and nervous on one end versus resilient, confident on the other end. Okay? So let's think about this for just a second in terms of trade-offs. Right? If human beings are going to be on these continuums of behavior, right, there are trade-offs involved. Right? We might do both things at different points, but in a given moment, we're going to land somewhere on the continuum. But let me go back to really highlight how this can show up for a person. If I go back to my early 20s, I was pretty academically driven, and so I got through school pretty quick, and I ended up in grad school for marriage and family therapy pretty early. I think I was probably 22 to 24 is where I landed there. And so that's pretty young for that kind of a program. In hindsight, I didn't know that at the time, but looking back, I thought maybe I could have given it a few more years. Okay? But my early 20s were definitely characterized by some high levels of neuroticism, right? Sensitive and nervous, maybe you're kind of gentle, right? For what my experience kind of felt like. Okay? So when you show up as edgy, right, and maybe a little bit tense, then what do other people tend to do? Right, they pull away a little bit, right? That's exactly the face they made at me, right? Yeah, lose that confidence. So what I recognized is like, hey, I'm having all this emotional activity, right? Or I went to a therapist at the time, and I took a test. He did an assessment with me, and he's like, everything looks pretty good, except this one thing is really high. And I was like, well, what is it? And he said, hypervigilance, right? Which is sort of the looking over your shoulder to see what's coming after you, right? So that sounds like high neuroticism, right? So there's a certain amount of that that was just my own anxiety, right, that I needed to work on. But here's the thing, is for years, I fought against that, and I'm thinking, I need to be less neurotic, I need to be less anxious, whatever, right? And the more I fought against it, the more intense it seemed to get. And eventually, I kind of ran out of steam with it, and I thought, you know what, maybe this isn't so bad. And what I started doing is what I kind of recognized is, hey, wait a minute. Like this sensitivity that I have to what's going on around me, there's actually a strength to that as well. Right? My ability to look for reasons and causes, because it turns out one of my strengths is actually being able to be really analytical, to assess a lot of kind of subtle information and come to some reasonably accurate conclusion about what's happening. Can you see how that high neuroticism is maybe the flip side of the coin for something that really was serving me well and something that brought value, both personally and professionally, to my work? And when I started recognizing that, and recognizing that, hey, for me to really embrace this strength, I also kind of have to embrace the other side of the coin and find some acceptance for, hey, this is kind of part of me. Right? And that's okay. And stop having the value judgments about it so much. Well, guess what happened? When I stopped trying so hard to not be neurotic, guess what happened? Right? Yeah, I kind of calmed down a little bit. And I think we do this to ourselves so much as human beings, where we have these judgments about how we should be or how we shouldn't be, and we don't recognize that we can't be everything to everyone. In the same way that your business can't be everything to everyone, and you can't straddle all segments and all lines of business, as individuals, we also can't do that. And when we learn to lean into our strengths, and also what that requires is to embrace our weaknesses, I think what we find is that we actually get a lot healthier, we get a lot happier, and we get a lot more effective in our life. So what this looks like, if I can do an illustration here, is again, all of these dimensions, and this is just one way to look at human personality, okay? These are all continuums. In a given moment, or in a given setting at least, right, I'm going to be somewhere along this continuum, right? So let's take, we'll put an E and an I. Oh, that's not a very good I, is it? I try hard. Okay. So we have more extroverted versus more introverted. Let's say you're more introverted, right over here. Maybe you're sort of in the middle if you take the average or in a given context. Maybe you're super extroverted. A lot of places you could be. And each point on this continuum is just going to represent a different list of pros and cons. And so instead of judging, oh, I'm too extroverted, personal growth means I need to find a middle point, and this is where everybody should live. This is what being an effective person, or this is what being the right kind of person means. Rather embracing, there are a lot of ways to be a healthy person. There are a lot of ways to be an effective person. Strengths and weaknesses, pros and cons at every point along this continuum. And that our job is not actually to become well-rounded. It's not to come to the middle of all of these spaces. It's actually to recognize, where do I live on this continuum in a given space? And how can I lean into the strengths of that and then navigate the weaknesses of it rather than trying to eliminate the weaknesses? We can't ignore those, right? But navigating rather than eliminating. Doesn't it feel like a weight off when you think like, okay, I don't have to change myself and be good at everything. I don't have to have all the good traits a human could have. I think we push that on each other so much. And again, coming back to, there's a lot of great ways to be a person. There's not a right way that we should all be gravitating towards. Okay? But it's how we develop and how we function in that space that really matters, right? And how we interact with ourselves and each other around those things. So when we talk about a strength is an area where we can really excel, right? Where our performance is excellent most of the time. Okay? And it's not just about talent. It's not just about skills. It's kind of a combination of a few things. Okay? And so the ingredients of a strength, if you look at it this way, you have talent, and we'll define talent as that natural ability, that recurring pattern, that proclivity to act or behave in a certain way. Now, where that comes from, talent, it's very much a nature and nurture thing. There's some genetics to it. There's also some life experience that influences that, especially early life experience has a lot of impact on personality down the road. And for example, whether we turn out to be more extroverted or more introverted, right? There's a lot to it. But talent, the key there is that it's innate. And you see that's the word that we have highlighted, or it's a synonym. Right? It's naturally occurring. Then we have skills. Okay, skills are acquired. We learn those over time. Anybody can learn a skill. Really, a skill is just a set of steps that we can engage in or follow to complete a task well. Right? So for example, something like good listening skills, sure, somebody might have a talent for listening where they're naturally a good listener. Okay? But the talent behind that is probably a proclivity more towards relationships and more towards being more empathetic and sensitive to what's going on for others. Listening is a skill, it's a set of steps. So for example, what are some of the behaviors that you would see from somebody that was being a really good listener? You were having a conversation with them and you felt like they were really hearing you. What are some of the things they would do? Okay, eye contact, right? With variance across culture, right? And individuals. So anybody can learn to practice those behaviors. Anybody can learn to listen. But then when you think about how that might mix with your talent, if you have a talent for just being really positive, and that's just your way of being, then you might listen with a tone of encouragement, right? Where when you listen to people, they feel encouraged. If you have a talent for empathy, right? You might listen with a tone of empathy and people just really feel cared about. If you have maybe a more analytical mind, right? You have a talent for being analytical and looking for reasons and causes. It might not show up as emotionally, but man, can't you communicate a really deep understanding of I can listen to you and I can understand deeply why you feel the way you feel and articulate that, right? Where somebody really feels seen. So that talent mixes with the skill, the set of steps, and kind of gives us our own flavor of how we show up in that given way. But again, a key difference here, talent, naturally occurring, innate, skills, more acquired. It's a set of steps that you can learn and follow and practice. And then the third ingredient is knowledge. And we gain knowledge in a lot of different ways. It can be by experience. Okay? My first couple of years that I was making that leap from the family therapy world to the leadership and organizational development world, right? I had some talent in that area. There were lots of things I knew how to do. I also had some skills. What I didn't have was a lot of knowledge about how this other world worked. The terminology, what kinds of situations am I going to be in? It was things I was seeing for the first time, right? But after a couple years of getting that experience, right, things start to repeat. I start to say, ooh, I've seen this before. Oh, hey, I get how that works. And that knowledge really starts to give some depth to the talents and skills that I already brought to the table. Right? Knowledge also comes from formal education, can come from association and just observing other people and learning how they do things. Okay? So when we think about a strength, okay, and there's a great quote at the top of this page. Hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. Right? And what that means, okay, is that if you have very little talent in a given area and you work really hard at skill and knowledge, you'll probably beat out somebody with talent eventually that isn't working hard. But when you think about when you mix talent and hard work in acquiring skills and knowledge, that's where we really thrive. This is how we get Olympians. Right? I could work really hard at becoming a great swimmer. I could develop a lot of knowledge and skills and just get really good at swimming. But you know what? The talent competition, I'm just never going to catch Michael Phelps. It's not going to happen. Okay? There's a gap there. And when we recognize that our own talents can be developed with skills and knowledge, and that really is going to be our most powerful asset, those are going to be our greatest strengths, that's where we can really start to thrive. What are some of the innate talents that you feel like you have? What are some of the skills and knowledge that you have that help elevate those talents and make them more applicable and more useful? And then also, what are opportunities for you to gain new skills and knowledge that help you use your talents more to the fullest of your ability and really develop those things into strengths? Okay? You had a little bit of time to think about talent and skills and knowledge and kind of work that out and let that percolate, all those things adding up to a strength. Sometimes it can be really challenging to figure out, wait, is this a talent or a skill? And honestly, there's a little bit of overlap. Anytime you're using some kind of construct like this, then, if you slice it thin enough, then everything starts to fall apart a little bit, right? So remember that this is a construct meant to be useful to help us understand ourselves, right, at this level. But one of the things that can be really useful is to think about themes where really true areas of talent can exist. And you can see these in your book. It's the same thing that's up here. 4 of the themes that will show up in a lot of different models and even in different assessments are things like relationship building. Right? Do I have a natural proclivity towards people and connecting with people in a certain way? And there's a lot of different specific talents that kind of could fall under that theme of relationship building. So for me, for example, my relationship building is not about a large network of people and making a high volume of light connections. Where I really thrive is when I can connect more deeply with a smaller group of people. And so one of the things that I try to do with my business is to be able to find those kinds of clients that really want to partner in that way, in a long-term sort of way, because that's where I'm really at my best, is when I'm in a relationship that's familiar for me and for them. And that's where I feel like I can offer the most. So I look for ways to try to do that. Now, one of the places where I struggle in that relationship building area is the other end of it. Networking was such a learning curve for me. I had to learn a lot of skills and I had to gain a lot of knowledge about how networking works. I know I've used that example because it's been on my mind quite a bit. It's an area where I do not have a high level of talent. I just don't. But I've gotten to be I would say I'm a B- networker at this point. But that's better than the grade I was getting when I first started. Right? I've gotten proficient. That doesn't have to be my strength. I just have to learn enough skills to sort of get by. And I can really find opportunities to lean into my more natural strengths in other ways. Some people just have this superpower for being results driven and results focused and getting things across the finish line and not letting things get in their way. We have influencing, such an important one. Right? Speaking up, right? Being able to kind of find your voice, make your voice heard, to motivate and persuade others, to advocate for yourself and advocate for others. Influencing is an area of talent. Strategic thinking, strategic action, really being able to analyze information and use it to make good decisions, to make informed decisions. Right? One of the things I always think is kind of interesting is when I'm working with somebody and maybe they're going through feedback that they got in a performance evaluation or something like that, then they get told, well, be more detail-oriented. And it's like, I don't know if I've ever seen someone just become more detail-oriented, right? Now, there's things you can do to mitigate the impact of not thinking that way, but being really focused on information and details, right, and really being analytical, it's kind of a way of thinking and a way of being, right? That lives in that theme of talent. Right? So as we focus our development, focus less on trying to acquire talents, things that are innate, and focus more on developing the talents you already have through building skills and building knowledge. And then also, this isn't to say that we don't have to think about our weaknesses. I think that's one of the elements of positive psychology that kind of leads to its lack of credibility sometimes, is people think like, well, things can't just be good all the time, right? There's a downside too that we have to deal with, and that's important, right? But the way we deal with it matters a lot. Okay? So we've talked about leaning into our strengths, developing those strengths. Okay? Let's also talk about how we can go about navigating our weaknesses. Okay? So a few ideas, right? There's lots of things you can do. These are 4 that I think really rise to the top. First, we have to build awareness of our weaknesses and the impact they have on us and on other people, and then take responsibility for that. Right? We all know those people where they might be having an impact and they just refuse to see it, or they see it and they refuse to take responsibility for it. So for example, if I am just maybe not particularly empathetic, or if I'm not a great listener, and I just tell people, hey, I'm not a great listener, deal with it, right? That's not a great way to deal with a weakness, right? We got to take responsibility and say things like, hey, sometimes I can miss, the emotions of a situation, and I don't mean to come off as, uncaring, right? Let me know, those kinds of things, and really being able to take responsibility for how we're showing up. Now, that's also true just for us as individuals. For me, it was really hard some days not to walk around and blame the networking events for me not being as successful as I'd like to be for having showed up. But at the end of the day, I'm the only person I can really control. And so being able to walk away saying, hey, this is not an area where I thrive, but it's my job to figure out the best that I can to deal with this. And I think when we get really good at taking responsibility without being hard on ourselves too much, to kind of have that neutral, hey, it is what it is. Let me see what I can do with it. It's just information that helps me be more effective, rather than feeling ashamed of ourselves or feeling like we're not good enough and those kinds of things. It's really important that as we take responsibility, that we also do it from a place of self-compassion and being kind to ourselves and being understanding of ourselves. My rule has always been that if you're saying things to yourself in your own head that you wouldn't say to a person that you liked and respected and cared about, then find other things to say to yourself. Right? We shouldn't be treating ourselves worse than we treat people that we care about. So we got to find that place of compassion so we can accept ourselves as we are. Second thing is to utilize our other strengths. Right? There's always interesting ways to lean into areas where we do have strengths in order to compensate for or mitigate some of the areas where we have weakness. So if we go all the way back to the beginning and we talk about a business strategy example, all the way back to IKEA, okay? So you look at the weakness in that model is, hey, people that don't like to assemble their own furniture, hey, we're missing out. Okay? But what IKEA did, they didn't suddenly change their whole business model. It's like what you said, they found a partner. And that partner was TaskRabbit, which was an organization where their whole mission, the whole way that they operate was, hey, we've got a giant network of people that are willing to do these kinds of tasks like assembling furniture at a reasonable price. So if anybody wants our products, but they don't want to do the thing of assembling it themselves, we can partner with this other group, TaskRabbit, to be able to do that. Right? They didn't, and IKEA eventually bought TaskRabbit, but it still operates independently, last I heard, right? Does its own thing. Partnering with others, which you see at the bottom, is another really useful way to mitigate some of the weaknesses that we might have. So sometimes what I'll do in my work is I'll do a 360 review for somebody where I interview, if they're a manager, some of their direct reports or some of their peers, their boss, other people around them, and collect some feedback for them that I can deliver in a way that's anonymous and useful and productive. And so I was doing a 360 for this guy. And as I talked to his employees, I kept hearing this phrase, like, oh, he's very professional. But they said it in a weird way, where I was like, what do they mean by that? It seems like there's a thing here. And so eventually, after I heard it 3 or 4 times, I asked the next person, okay, what do you mean when you say he's very professional? Okay? And what they were actually doing is, rather than trying to sound negative, right, they were trying to say it in a way that didn't sound so bad. But what they were basically saying is like, oh, he can be a little bit clunky socially, right? Can come off a little bit terse, a little bit short, not a man of many words, right? And so that can be a little bit off sometimes. And that's what they meant. But the reason that they were trying to say it in such a positive way is because everybody trusted this guy so much because he was reliable. They also would say things like, I never have to ask him for anything twice. Things just don't tend to fall through the cracks with him. If he comes up against an obstacle, he'll let me know so I don't get surprised. And because he was so good at that reliability piece, then that being clunky in interpersonal communication was sort of forgiven in a way. So that weakness when it comes to relationship building was kind of made up for by the strength in reliability, right? Which is really more of an executing thing for him. It was more about getting things done, and he was so focused on that. But he could use that talent and that strength to also build relationships, to make up for an area where he didn't naturally maybe have that proclivity. Right? So that's an example of how we can use a strength in real life to maybe compensate for the impact of a weakness. Right? That's a great question. One thing we haven't addressed here, right? We've addressed lean on others, utilize your other strengths, building awareness and taking responsibility. Number 3 is get 20% better. Right? What that's about is saying, hey, if my weakness in this area is impacting my success or my performance in some way, the idea isn't that I need to take this weakness and make it my greatest strength. But instead, what if I just focused on getting 20% better by building some skills? Right? Maybe I recognize that relationship building is not a strength for me, but if I can get really, really good at listening, right, I'm going to get 20% better at that relationship building. And what we find is if we get 20% better at doing that thing, that sometimes we resolve way more than 20% of the impact of that weakness just by getting a little better. So when I say get 20% better, right, I really mean 20%. Right? I don't so much think that turning our weaknesses into our greatest strengths is a good use of our time. Right? We get a lot more out of investing our development in talent areas. Okay? But it can be worthwhile to learn some skills to mitigate impact at times. Right? Just don't spend all of that time trying to make it your best thing. Right? I think it's cliche and way overused, but you've heard the 80-20 rule, right? Like 20% of your efforts are accountable for 80% of your results. This is kind of a good application for that. 20% of my efforts to get a little better at this account for 80% of the results, right? And you know what? Maybe getting 80% is really good enough. And then I can really focus on these other areas where the dividends pay off a little bit more. Right? So that said, okay, we talked about navigating weaknesses, talked about developing our strengths. As we get to the end here, I want to talk about context, both the context we create for ourselves, and this isn't in your books because I think this part runs a little bit deeper, and I think it's really important that we can have conversations about this. So definitely feel free to take notes. But when we talk about internal context, this is the environment we create in our own minds that impact how we choose to grow and develop. A lot of this is our self-talk. How do we talk to ourselves? What beliefs do we carry about ways that we should be or shouldn't be? Okay. So if we go back to earlier, you remember we were talking about the ocean model for personality, right? And we were looking at some different dimensions of human behavior. Okay. What are some of the things that you find yourself having judgments about as being negative? I shared for me, right, it was that neuroticism piece. It's like, ooh, that sounds really bad. Maybe I should get rid of that. Right? And I talked you through what my process was on that. Okay? But what are some of your associations when you think of introversion and extroversion? For example, when you think of conscientiousness, really paying attention to what's going on around you, right? Versus being a little more carefree. Do you find yourself having some judgments about maybe what the right way to be is? Yeah. Okay. So what happens when you impose those on yourself? Like, oh, I'm pretty quiet and reserved, right? But I look around and I see successful people being really outgoing, thinking I should be like somebody else more than I should be like me, versus looking at, hey, what's my best stuff? And what are the advantages of the way that I am, right? We get into that comparison game of, oh, I wish I was more like that person. I'll admit it, right? Like I said, when my wife and I go to these networking events together, I'm like, God, how did she get so much of that? And I got so little. How did that happen? It's so easy to get overly self-critical rather than focusing on the strength that's attached to that. Now, one way that we can get around this is whenever you're looking at a weakness, a thing that you have that you're like, oh, that's not serving me, that's not good, then thinking to yourself, well, what's on the other side of that coin? What's the strength that might be attached to this weakness? Because often a strength that we have and a weakness that we have, you can trace them back to the same source, to the same motivation. Right? And when we recognize that this is a package deal, and we get a little bit less judgmental towards ourselves, when we make our inner environment more accepting and more kind, we'll find that it's much easier to grow. Right? When we accept ourselves, we'll find that as we are, we'll find that that's when we grow the most. Okay? So one thing to think about, okay, maybe one thing to put on your action items page, okay, is what are some adjustments that I can make to my self-talk to create a more friendly environment for myself to grow? Because the thing about yourself is you really can't get away. You're always there. Really tough. You take yourself wherever you go. Okay. So whatever environment you create for yourself when you're driving home from work, in your car, even in settings with other people, you're just always present. How can I make that environment more friendly and conducive to my growth, more accepting? Okay. So I'm going to give you a second just to think about that and make maybe a note to yourself on that action items page in your journals. One thing you could do to improve that internal environment. That's a good question to come back to from time to time too. How can I make my inner environment more friendly, more conducive to my own growth? Okay. Now there's also the external environment that we create for others and that others create for us. And this is where I loved your question, Linus, earlier, about where you have a talent, but being able to articulate that talent and deliver it to others. Sometimes there can be a barrier there, right? And I really appreciate that because I think a lot of people experience that in one way or another, where I've got this thing to offer and I just don't quite know how to get it from me to the other person. Yeah. And to be really frank, I think we need each other's help on this one, right? The responsibility isn't all on each individual to, I've got to fight my way through that. I think in the same way that we need to be kind to ourselves, we also have to be kind to each other. And we have to look past our own biases and our own judgments when it comes to other people. Right? I know early in life for me, I was a pretty serious kid, pretty serious teenager in a lot of ways growing up. Had a pretty serious attitude about things. Right? Probably had something to do with that neuroticism thing I talked about earlier. But one of the judgments I had about other people is when I saw others that were mostly driven by kind of positivity or just having a good time, having fun, right? To me, I would judge that as frivolous, right? If life for you is just about having fun, having a good time, it felt, for me, kind of irresponsible in a way. And as I got partway through my 20s, I recognized how judgmental I actually was being of people around me and recognizing that, hey, their motivation for how they act and how they live their life is just different than mine. It's no worse, no better. And when I stopped being quite so judgmental about that, you know what? I think I freed up some space for the people around me to be themselves a little bit more. Right? And I didn't even know that I was really having that judgment or that bias in my own mind. I will call it an education-assisted insight, right? Where nobody told me directly, hey, Andy, you're kind of judgmental of this kind of a person. But it was this moment where I was learning something about different personalities and the different ways that people show up in the world. And I had this moment where I recognized, oh, wait a minute. I'm totally doing this thing where I don't recognize that as a legitimate way of being. And it was a moment, it hurts a little bit to recognize I didn't see myself as a judgmental person, but in that moment, there it was. And everybody has some of those things. And when you're confronted with it, the important thing is to be able to have the ego strength or the confidence or the sense of self to not be so kind of shaken by it that you can't see it as information that you can use to be a little healthier, to be a little better. Yeah. So for me, that's what it was in that case. Yeah. And that's why opportunities like this can be really helpful. That's why I encourage the aha page and the action items page, is because you never know when one of those things is going to show up where you realize this is something that I just learned about myself, something useful. Okay. Now, when we think about, sorry, our last slide, big letters. Okay. When we think about that bias and judgment, there's a lot of different kinds of people in the world. And like I said, there's a lot of great ways to be a person. And if we can look past what somebody looks like, how somebody talks, what their background is, how they're different from us, if we can look beyond that and see what people have to offer and find ways to clear the path for them to offer their best, I think that's one of the best things we can do for each other. What a cool gift to give somebody, right? If they're having a hard time delivering their best and I can create a path for you to do that more easily, that's a cool gift. And I think we need each other's help on that sometimes. Last thought here, as we get to the end. Okay? If I were to summarize everything that we've been talking about today, this is what I'd say, is that leaning into your strengths is a better investment of your time and your energy and your focus than trying to eliminate our weaknesses. Sure, get 20% better. Sure, learn some skills that mitigate the impact of your weaknesses. Don't sleep on that as an opportunity. But at the end of the day, figuring out what are my best talents and how can I focus my development on that, that's where we're really going to find our best stuff. And personally, for us as human beings, also in business, it's what matters. And to really tie it all back to the beginning, it's all about being able to accept trade-offs and realize that as a person, I don't have to be everything to everyone. As a business, I don't have to be everything to everyone. I just need to be the best version of myself and figure out who I'm trying to be and who I'm trying to be that person with.